Japanese bombs killed 2,403, but 68 Hawaiian civilians died from American anti-aircraft shells falling back to Earth. The Navy buried the report. December 7, 1941. The sky above Pearl Harbor was painted in fire. Sirens wailed across Honolulu as Japanese bombers tore through the morning calm. The world remembers the flames, the sinking ships, the smoke curling from the USS Arizona. But hidden beneath that chaos was a quieter, more tragic story, one that would remain buried for decades. As the first waves of Japanese aircraft thundered in, American gunners on Oahu scrambled to respond. They had never faced an air raid before. There were no radar-guided systems, no practiced defense drills, just men grabbing their weapons and firing blindly at the sky. In their panic, they unleashed thousands of anti-aircraft shells, meant to strike the enemy. But every round that missed had to come down somewhere. When those shells fell, they didn't fall harmlessly into the sea. They rained back onto the homes, streets, and families of Honolulu. Within minutes, explosions echoed not just at the naval base, but deep in civilian neighborhoods. People who had no part in the battle suddenly found themselves in the middle of it, running for shelter as fragments of American steel ripped through their houses. On the outskirts of the city, families huddled together, believing the Japanese had followed the Navy inland. They didn't know that the danger was coming from above, from their own defenders. In one small neighborhood near downtown Honolulu, a young mother tried to pull her children under the bed as the roof shattered. A shell had struck the corner of their home, killing 2 instantly. By the time the chaos settled, dozens of civilians had been hit by American shells that fell back to Earth after missing their targets. The Navy called it friendly fire, but for the people of Hawaii, there was nothing friendly about it. When the smoke cleared over Pearl Harbor, the damage was unimaginable. The USS Arizona lay broken beneath the waves. The USS Oklahoma had capsized. Over 2,400 Americans were dead. But among them, 68 names didn't belong to sailors or soldiers. They belonged to civilians, store clerks, mothers, children, killed not by enemy planes, but by the desperate defense of their own country. In the hours that followed, military officials rushed to contain the chaos. Honolulu was placed under martial law. Curfews, blackouts, and censorship spread across the island. The government needed to maintain morale, and that meant keeping certain truths hidden. As officials tallied the dead, the cause of those civilian deaths was quietly rewritten. Reports referred vaguely to bomb fragments or collateral explosions. The full story of the American shells was sealed in classified files. But whispers began to circulate. Nurses at Queen's Hospital spoke of injuries that didn't match Japanese ordnance. Local police noted the direction of impact, shells falling almost vertically, not horizontally like bombs. Some suspected the truth, but few dared to speak. The nation was at war now, and in times of war, truth often becomes the first casualty. Across the Pacific, President Roosevelt was preparing his address, a date which will live in infamy. The country needed unity, not guilt. Admitting that American fire had killed its own civilians would complicate the narrative of heroism and victimhood. So, the tragedy was erased from the headlines before it even reached the mainland. The families who lost loved ones were told their deaths were caused by the Japanese attack. Many accepted it, some didn't. But in the frenzy of patriotism, few voices could rise above the roar for vengeance. Meanwhile, in the ruins of downtown Honolulu, recovery crews worked silently. Streets were littered with unexploded shells. Craters marked the places where American rounds had landed. Children pointed at fragments stamped U.S. Navy and asked questions their parents couldn't answer. Soldiers quietly collected what evidence they could, under strict orders not to discuss what they found. Behind the scenes, Navy investigators pieced together the grim reality. Thousands of anti-aircraft rounds had been fired in panic, with no coordination, no control. Many were timed fuses, meant to detonate after reaching a certain altitude. But those that didn't explode in the air returned to Earth with lethal precision. The final count: 68 civilians dead, over 100 injured. Every one of them struck by their own nation's defense. For years, the truth remained hidden in classified military archives. The official Pearl Harbor casualty reports listed all deaths under a single tragic total. Civilians and soldiers, Japanese and American, all blurred into one. The buried files told a different story, a story of chaos, fear, and human error. But in the patriotic wave that followed, no one was ready to hear it. That night, as fires still burned in the harbor, the people of Honolulu gathered what remained of their lives. Families slept in basements and churches, too afraid to return home. The Army promised to rebuild, to protect, to avenge. But for those who lost someone to the falling shells, there would never be comfort, only questions and silence. They would wait decades for the truth to emerge. In the weeks after the attack, Honolulu no longer felt like paradise. The palm trees still swayed, the ocean still shimmered, but fear clung to every street. Soldiers patrolled corners where children once played. Searchlights swept the night sky, chasing shadows that no longer existed. Beneath that uneasy calm, there was an unspoken grief. For the ships that burned, for the men who drowned, and for the civilians who died without reason. The newspapers spoke of heroism, of vengeance, of the American spirit unbroken. But no one wrote about the families in Honolulu who buried their loved ones under palm crosses and silence. The government called it a wartime necessity, censorship to protect morale. Investigations were conducted quietly, away from public eyes, under the title Civilian Damage Inquiry. Those who took part were told their findings would never be made public. Inside a small naval office, boxes of reports stacked higher every day. Medical examiners described shrapnel wounds inconsistent with Japanese bombs. Witnesses recalled hearing anti-aircraft bursts before explosions struck their neighborhoods. The conclusion was clear. The U.S. defenses had killed their own. But instead of acknowledgement, the files were stamped classified and locked away. The Navy's official story became the only story. Civilians were told they were war casualties. Families received telegrams written in cold, careful language. Killed during the attack on Pearl Harbor. No mention of friendly fire, no hint of error, just a neatly folded condolence that carried a truth no one wanted to face. Yet not everyone stayed silent. In the years after the war, a few local journalists and historians began to dig deeper. They found fragments of shell casings in old basements, pieces marked with American ordnance numbers. They uncovered forgotten morgue reports, eyewitness accounts that contradicted the official narrative. But every attempt to publish was met with resistance. National security, they were told. Old wounds. Move on. It wasn't until the 1960s, 2 decades later, that the truth began to surface. A Navy archivist, reviewing long-sealed files for declassification, stumbled upon a report titled Civilian Casualties, Honolulu District, 68 Fatalities. The attached notes described the source of the explosions as errant anti-aircraft projectiles. It was an accidental confession, the government's own acknowledgement that American shells had killed its people that day. But by then, most of the victims' families were gone, their stories lost to time. When this information quietly emerged in historical circles, it barely made the news. America was already deep into another war, Vietnam, and few had patience for new ghosts from the past. But for those who remember December 7, 1941, the revelation reopened old wounds. Survivors who had lived their lives believing the Japanese had killed their loved ones now learned the truth. It wasn't the enemy, but their own defenders. There was no apology, no monument, no official mention in the grand memorials of Pearl Harbor. The dead sailors were heroes. The dead civilians were statistics. The government maintained that in the chaos of war, mistakes were inevitable. And so the story faded again, tucked away between history's louder pages. But memory has a way of surviving in silence. In old homes across Honolulu, descendants of the victims kept photographs, fragments of shells, yellowed letters from the War Department. They told stories at dinner tables of the morning the sky fell, of the explosions that came from nowhere. To them, the war never truly ended. Decades later, historians revisiting the Pearl Harbor archives would describe this event as one of the most overlooked civilian tragedies in American military history. The Japanese attack was an act of aggression, but the falling shells were something else entirely, a reflection of panic, fear, and the human cost of confusion. It wasn't malice that killed those 68 people. It was chaos. Today, tourists visit Pearl Harbor and gaze upon the white memorial above the sunken USS Arizona. They whisper, they mourn, they honor. Few realize that just miles away, families were once burying their dead from the same day, victims not of Japan, but of their own side's desperate defense. No plaques mark those streets, no guide tells their story. But history, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way back to light. In 2016, a small group of local historians in Hawaii finally published a detailed study, confirming the friendly fire tragedy. For the first time, the victims' names were listed. Teachers, store clerks, children as young as 6. The forgotten civilians of Pearl Harbor were remembered, not as footnotes, but as part of the full truth. Their story reminds us that even in our most heroic moments, humanity's flaws still shape the outcome. War doesn't just claim soldiers, it claims innocence, it distorts truth, and it leaves scars that take generations to heal. The bombs that fell on Honolulu didn't just destroy buildings, they shattered trust, erased truth, and tested the conscience of a nation. 80 years later, the echoes of that morning still linger. The ships rest beneath the sea. The flags still wave above the memorial. But somewhere, beyond the museum lights and the polished tours, the sky that rained fire still haunts Hawaii's memory. Because the greatest tragedy of Pearl Harbor wasn't only the attack, it was the truth America chose to hide.